Get comfortable, settle in, maybe dim the lights, pull the blanket up a little higher. We are going to walk through the entire Resident Evil story tonight. Every major chapter, every turning point, every catastrophe that turned a quiet pharmaceutical company into the source of almost every biological disaster the world has ever seen. This is a long one, a proper deep dive, the kind you put on when you want something rich and detailed to carry you through the night. We are starting at the very beginning, before Raccoon City, before the mansions and the laboratories and the creatures that lived inside them, before any of the names that became legend in this franchise were anything more than people living ordinary lives. We are going back to the moment the infection was born, not in a laboratory, not in a test tube, but in the mind of one man who decided that humanity was broken and needed to be fixed. What the Resident Evil franchise has been doing for nearly 30 years is something unusual in entertainment. It has been telling the same story from different angles, in different genres, with different characters, and asking the same set of questions about it's about what we are willing to do in the name of progress. Each game adds a piece. Each revelation repositions something we thought we understood. And when you lay all the pieces out in order, not the release order, but the story order, the chronological sequence of events as they happened in the world, these games built. A picture emerges that is more coherent and more unsettling than any individual entry could produce on its own. So, tonight we are doing that, the whole thing, from the beginning. We are going to spend time with every chapter that deserves it, linger in the places where the story is doing something genuinely interesting, and try to trace the thread that connects the first murder in the Arklay Mountains to the last flash of light over a Romanian village on a February night in 2021. Every virus, every corporation, every person who thought they were the exception to the pattern they were creating. This is the complete Resident Evil timeline. Every chapter, every consequence, every moment that built toward the next disaster, and we are taking our time with it. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Ambition. The birth of Umbrella. The story of Resident Evil does not begin in 1998. It does not begin with a mansion in the mountains or a city falling apart at the seams. It begins decades earlier, somewhere in the drawing rooms and lecture halls of mid-20th century Europe, where a young man named Oswell Spencer started forming ideas about the future of human life that were, depending on your point of view, either visionary or deeply terrifying. Spencer was born into British aristocracy sometime in the early 1920s. Wealth surrounded him from the beginning. Not the modest comfort of a middle-class household, but the generational, self-perpetuating kind that insulates people from the ordinary friction of the world. He grew up in estates. He attended university at a time when higher education was still largely a privilege, not a right. He trained as a physician, which meant he understood the human body at a biological level, the machinery of it, the elegance and the fragility of it, in a way most people never would. But Spencer was not content to simply understand the human body. He wanted to change it. In his years at university, Spencer formed close relationships with two other men who shared his particular fascination with human biology and its limitations. The first was Edward Ashford, who came from a noble family with its own history of scientific inquiry. The second was a man named James Marcus, who would go on to become one of the most significant and most tragic figures in the early history of Umbrella. The three of them circulated in the same academic spaces, attended the same lectures, disagreed with each other in productive ways, and collectively arrived at a shared conviction that human beings, as they currently existed, were inadequate. This was not a fringe idea at the time. The mid-20th century had a complicated relationship with the concept of directed human evolution. Eugenics, the idea that humanity could be improved through selective breeding or genetic management, was taught at major universities across Europe and America. Governments had funded research into it. Respected scientists had written books advocating for it. The fact that these ideas had also fueled some of the worst atrocities of the century had not yet fully discredited the underlying intellectual impulse, the desire to take control of what human beings could become, rather than leaving it to the slow, indifferent process of natural selection. Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus formed what they called a eugenics circle. Their particular vision went beyond the selective breeding theories that had already fallen into disrepute. They were interested in something more direct, more immediate, not influencing which humans reproduced with which other humans across generations. They wanted to change what humans were at a cellular level, right now, within a single lifetime. They wanted a mechanism, a biological mechanism, that could rewrite the human blueprint the way a programmer rewrites code, something that could be introduced into the body and directed to produce specific changes, something that could bridge the gap between the human being that existed today and the superior version they believed could exist tomorrow. What they needed was a virus, specifically, a naturally occurring virus with mutagenic properties, something that evolution had already built, that they could study and eventually control and direct. Spencer, in the early 1950s, went looking for it. The search led him, after considerable effort and several false starts, to West Africa, to a remote region where the landscape was ancient and the plant life included species that existed nowhere else on Earth. And it was there, reportedly through contact with a tribe called the Indipaya, that Spencer discovered what he had been searching for. The flower was called the Stairway to the Sun, an unusual plant with unusual properties. Exposure to the plant, or to the substance it produced, caused dramatic biological changes in anyone who came into contact with it. In most cases, those changes were fatal. The body simply could not accommodate what was happening to it. Organ failure, rapid cellular degradation, death, usually swift and unpleasant. But in rare cases, very rare, perhaps one in tens of thousands, something different happened. The biological changes stabilized. The person who had been exposed did not die. Instead, they came out the other side of the process changed in ways that seemed almost impossible. Enhanced strength, extraordinary resistance to injury, a biology that had been fundamentally rewritten at the cellular level. The substance produced by the Stairway to the Sun, once isolated and studied, became known as the progenitor virus. And it was exactly what Spencer had been searching for. Here is what matters about the progenitor virus, and why it became the foundation for everything that followed. It was a naturally occurring mutagenic agent capable of rewriting the genetic blueprint of any organism it infected. Not randomly, not clumsily, but with a precision that suggested billions of years of evolutionary refinement. The virus integrated with host DNA. It copied sections of the genetic code, altered them, reinserted them. It changed what an organism fundamentally was at the most basic biological level. The problem was control. In its natural state, the progenitor virus was extraordinarily selective about which hosts it worked on in the way Spencer wanted. For the vast majority of people, infection was simply lethal. To make the virus useful, to turn it into the tool Spencer had envisioned, it would need to be modified, studied, refined. The process of developing it into something that could reliably produce the directed mutations Spencer wanted would require laboratories, researchers, funding, and time. Decades of it. Spencer came back from Africa with samples and a plan. He convinced Ashford and Marcus to join him in establishing a formal research institution that would allow them to pursue the work properly, to fund the research and maintain a public face that would not immediately attract the attention of governments and oversight bodies. They decided to establish a pharmaceutical company. The company would develop legitimate medical products. The profits would fund the classified research into what they were calling the T-Virus Project, their attempt to modify the progenitor virus into something more controllable, something that could produce the directed mutations they wanted without simply killing everyone it touched. In 1968, Umbrella Pharmaceuticals was officially founded. Oswell Spencer, Edward Ashford, and James Marcus were listed as co-founders. The company established legitimate pharmaceutical research divisions in Europe and North America. It began developing real products, medications, vaccines, the kind of things that built a corporate reputation and generated revenue and attracted government contracts. On paper, it was simply a successful pharmaceutical company. In reality, it was a front for one of the most ambitious and eventually catastrophic biological research programs in history. Spencer moved quickly and with a particular kind of ruthlessness that would become his signature. He recognized early that the gap between his vision and what Marcus and Ashford wanted was significant. Ashford was primarily a scientist. He wanted to understand the progenitor virus, not necessarily to weaponize it. Marcus was brilliant but difficult, prone to obsession and deeply protective of his own research territory. Spencer wanted an empire. He wanted the kind of institutional power that would allow him to pursue directed human evolution on a global scale. To ensure that power, Spencer made decisions that were, even by the standards of someone who had already decided that ordinary ethical constraints did not apply to him, remarkably cold. He commissioned the construction of several research facilities, the most significant of which was a massive combined mansion and underground laboratory in the Arklay mountain range outside a small American city called Raccoon City. The mansion was designed by an architect named George Trevor, who poured years of his life into the project, creating a building of extraordinary complexity, hidden passages, secret rooms, security systems that would confound anyone trying to navigate the property without specific knowledge of its layout. When the work was completed, Spencer lured Trevor and his family to the mansion under the pretense of a social visit, and then he had them killed. Their bodies were buried somewhere in the property they had helped build. Their mouths were permanently closed. The plans they had drawn up went with them. This is who Spencer was, not a man constrained by ordinary considerations of human worth. A man who had decided, at some fundamental level, that the people around him were either useful or in the way. In the early 1950s, before any of the above had fully taken shape, Spencer had also made a brief detour into the mountains of Eastern Europe, following rumors of something unusual in an isolated village. He got lost in the mountains, as he was not an experienced outdoor traveler, and was found nearly dead from exposure by a woman named Miranda, a biologist who lived in the village and who had been conducting her own experiments with an ancient fungal organism living beneath the mountains. What Miranda showed Spencer over the months that followed fundamentally informed everything Umbrella would eventually build. But that chapter of the story will surface later, when the threads of the Resident Evil timeline loop back on themselves in ways that are only fully visible from the end. What matters now is that by the late 1960s, Umbrella existed. The progenitor virus had been isolated and was being studied. James Marcus, working with samples of the virus at Umbrella's executive training facility in the Arklay Mountains, was pursuing his own line of research, something he called the T-virus, a modification of the progenitor virus achieved through a specific kind of biological carrier. He was using leeches, parasitic organisms that he infected with the progenitor virus, studying how the virus interacted with the leech's biology, and then studying what happened when those infected leeches interacted with other organisms. The results were extraordinary and horrifying. The modified virus, the T-virus, could be transmitted far more easily than the raw progenitor virus. It did not kill most hosts immediately, though what it did to them was arguably worse. Infected organisms underwent dramatic physical transformation. Their biology was rewritten at a cellular level. But the direction of those changes was not what Spencer had hoped for. Rather than producing enhanced superior organisms, the T-virus produced monsters, creatures whose bodies had been warped into shapes that prioritized aggression and durability over intelligence or coordination. And it produced the dead that walked. This was the discovery that changed everything. The T-virus could reanimate deceased tissue, not in any supernatural sense. There was no soul being recalled, no divine reversal of death's chemistry. But the virus could, after a host organism died, continue operating within the dead cells. It could replace the biological processes that had ceased with viral approximations of those processes. It could make the dead move, react, consume. Not think, not plan, not feel, but move and consume, endlessly, mindlessly, hungrily. Marcus understood what he had and what it meant. Spencer understood it differently. Marcus saw a scientific achievement of staggering significance. Spencer saw a weapon. The relationship between the three founders of Umbrella was always uneasy, and as the research progressed and the applications became clearer, it fractured entirely. By the early 1970s, Spencer had decided that Marcus was becoming a liability. Marcus had his own ambitions. He had a particular vision for what the research should achieve that did not perfectly align with Spencer's plans for directed weaponization. He had also been using his training facility to run unauthorized experiments on children, young recruits who had been brought to the facility for what they believed was a gifted student program, and who had instead become test subjects for Marcus's early T-virus research. Spencer made a decision. He sent two of his most promising young researchers, William Birkin and Albert Wesker, to deal with Marcus. In 1978, they arranged for Marcus to be murdered, shot, and dumped in the very laboratory where he had conducted his experiments. His research notes were claimed by Umbrella. His work was folded into the broader T-virus project, and the training facility, the site of years of illegal human experimentation, was quietly sealed. But Marcus was not quite finished. This detail becomes relevant later, in the summer of 1998, when the leeches that had lived in his sealed laboratory for 20 years began doing something that nobody had anticipated. Edward Ashford, meanwhile, had died years earlier, infected with the progenitor virus under circumstances that were never fully explained, and that Spencer never showed much interest in investigating. His son, Alexander Ashford, carried on the family's involvement with Umbrella in a diminished capacity. Alexander's own children, twins named Alfred and Alexia, would become significant figures in a later chapter of the story, far from Raccoon City, on a remote island in the South Pacific. Through the 1970s and 80s, Umbrella grew. The pharmaceutical side of the business continued to generate revenue and respectability. The underground research continued to produce results, not always the results anyone had hoped for, but results. Researchers refined the T-virus. They created specific strains optimized for different applications. They developed bioorganic weapons, creatures engineered specifically for combat, designed to be controllable, lethal to enemy combatants, and capable of being deployed and then contained. The Hunters were an early example. The Tyrant program was the most ambitious. The Tyrant project aimed to create the perfect bioorganic weapon, a creature that retained enough intelligence to receive and execute basic orders, but whose physical capabilities had been enhanced far beyond anything natural biology could produce. The T-virus modification required for the project was extraordinarily precise. Too much viral activity, and the host's intelligence would be destroyed along with its humanity, leaving only an aggressive creature with no capacity for direction. The project required test subjects, which Umbrella obtained through a combination of coercion, deception, and procurement methods that were kept well away from any documentation that might be reviewed by outside parties. By the early 1990s, Umbrella had facilities on multiple continents. It had government contracts in several countries. It had a board of directors and quarterly earnings reports and all the apparatus of a respectable multinational corporation. It also had laboratories full of illegal biological weapons, underground facilities where human beings were being used as test subjects, and a growing list of incidents that had been quietly suppressed, small outbreaks, escaped specimens, researchers who had been infected and eliminated before anyone outside the company could ask questions. The Arklay facility outside Raccoon City was the crown jewel of the American operation. It had been operating since the early 1970s, producing research on the T-virus and on various bioorganic weapon candidates. The laboratory was accessible through a series of tunnels beneath the Spencer mansion, which served as both a physical barrier between the outside world and the laboratory, and as a testing ground for the security systems that protected Umbrella's work. In the spring of 1998, something in the Arklay facility went wrong. The specific cause was traced to a containment failure. A T-virus sample had been improperly secured, and the virus had begun spreading through the facility's water system and ventilation network. One by one, the researchers and staff who worked in the mansion and the laboratory below it were infected. Their symptoms progressed from fever and disorientation to full viral transformation, and within weeks, the facility was populated almost entirely by the walking dead. The monsters that had been created and contained in the laboratory were now loose in the tunnels. The experiments were over, in the sense that the experimenters were gone, but the results of those experiments remained. The murders began appearing in the local news. Hikers went missing in the forests near the Arklay Mountains. Bodies were discovered with injuries consistent with animal attacks, except the wound patterns did not match any animal the area had ever been known to contain. Raccoon City's police department received reports of people in the woods who were behaving strangely, disoriented, aggressive, unresponsive to commands. There were stories about someone eating a body on a hiking trail, cannibalistic attacks, things that had no logical explanation. The Raccoon Police Department had a special unit. The Special Tactics and Rescue Service, STARS, was an elite division that handled unusual or high-risk situations beyond the capability of standard patrol officers. Raccoon City had two STARS teams, Bravo Team and Alpha Team. The unit was, without the knowledge of most of its members, partially funded by Umbrella Corporation. This was not unusual. Umbrella contributed to several civic institutions in Raccoon City, which was in several senses a company town. The corporation was the largest employer in the region. Its research facilities dotted the Arklay mountain range, Its presence was woven through the economic and institutional life of the city in ways that made it simultaneously everywhere and invisible. Nobody asks too many questions about a company that pays salaries and sponsors community events and makes sure the police department has good equipment. The murders in the forest were a problem that the corporation would have preferred to manage quietly. The contamination of the Arklay facility, the spread of the T-virus through the mansion staff and the surrounding ecosystem, the creatures that had escaped the laboratory and were now moving through the forest, all of this was supposed to be contained within the Arklay perimeter by Umbrella's own response mechanisms. But bodies had been found. The pressure from the public had grown to the point where doing nothing was more conspicuous than doing something. By the summer of 1998, both of them were about to walk into something that neither had been trained for and that neither would fully survive. If you are still awake out there, if you are listening in the quiet, drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. There is something genuinely comforting about knowing people are spread across different time zones, all settling into the same story at the same moment. And if you have not already, the subscribe button means a great deal for getting these long-form dives in front of more people. Now, where were we? Right, July 1998. The forest outside Raccoon City is full of things that should not be there, and Bravo Team is about to find out. Chapter 2, Into the Dark, Resident Evil 0, July 23rd, 1998. The night of July 23rd, 1998, was clear enough over the Arklay mountain range. The forest stretched for miles in every direction below, dense and dark and ancient, the kind of woodland that had been there long before the city existed, and that would probably be there long after. A helicopter cut through the air above it, carrying the 6 members of STAR's Bravo team toward an area that had been producing disturbing reports for weeks. Bravo team was led by Captain Enrico Marini, experienced, steady, the kind of commander his team trusted without having to think too hard about it. His crew included communications expert Richard Aiken, pilot Edward Dewey, sharpshooter Forrest Spire, chemist Kenneth Sullivan, and the youngest member of the unit, Rebecca Chambers. Rebecca was 18 years old and had joined Bravo team in June of that year. A child prodigy who had graduated from university with a degree in biochemistry at an age when most of her peers were still trying to pick a major, she had turned down recruitment offers from several pharmaceutical companies, including, apparently, Umbrella itself, in favor of a career in law enforcement. This was her first field mission. The helicopter went down almost immediately. The engine failure was not accidental, though Bravo team had no way of knowing that yet. Someone within the STARS organization was in communication with people at Umbrella, and the sabotage of Bravo team's helicopter was part of a larger plan to use the STARS units as unknowing test subjects for Umbrella's bioorganic weapons. Bringing them into the Arklay facility and watching how trained combat professionals engaged with the creatures inside would generate invaluable combat data. But for now, Bravo team knew none of that. They knew only that their helicopter had gone down in the forest, that their radio contact was unreliable, and that the forest around them was very quiet in a way that forests near population centers usually are not. The crash landing was hard but survivable. No immediate casualties. The team spread out to get their bearings and discovered, almost immediately, that something was wrong. An overturned military police vehicle sat at the edge of a forest road, its occupants dead inside. Among the documents scattered from the wreck was a transport manifest. A prisoner was being moved for execution. A former Marine Force reconnaissance lieutenant named Billy Cohen, convicted of killing 23 people, was being brought to a military base. He was not among the dead in the vehicle, which meant he had survived the crash and fled into the same forest where Bravo team had just landed. While the rest of the team began establishing a perimeter and looking for their missing prisoner, Rebecca found something else. Parked on a set of old rail tracks in a clearing at the edge of the tree line was a train. Not a public transit train, a sleek private corporate rail car emblazoned with the Umbrella logo, the Ecliptic Express, a private passenger train used by Umbrella to transport personnel between its Arklay mountain facilities. The train was not empty. Rebecca went aboard to investigate and found the passengers had been transformed. Not injured, not dead in any conventional sense, transformed. The people who had been sitting in those seats hours earlier were now something else. Lurching through the passenger cars, their eyes vacant, their bodies wrong in ways that were difficult to process quickly. They moved toward her, They were hungry in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day or the last meal they had eaten. Rebecca ran. Or rather, she assessed the situation with the kind of rapid tactical thinking that had earned her a spot on Stars in the first place. And she moved deeper into the train looking for answers and a way out. This is where she met Billy Cohen. He was not what the transport document suggested. Billy was large and tattooed and looked every inch the dangerous convicted killer his file described. He had a pair of handcuffs still dangling from one wrist. He regarded Rebecca with the kind of flat, assessing gaze of someone who has spent time in environments where trust is a liability. But he was not attacking anyone. He was trying to survive the same situation Rebecca was trying to survive. And when the train jolted back into motion, the Umbrella Security Service's Delta team had restarted it remotely as part of their own operation. Survival suddenly required cooperation, whether either of them was comfortable with it. They were an unlikely pair. Rebecca Chambers, 18 years old, first mission, more comfortable with chemical analysis than hand-to-hand combat. Billy Cohen, facing a death sentence, trying to stay alive long enough to figure out where to go next. They fought their way through the infected passengers. They found their way to the locomotive and managed to stop the train before it derailed. And then they followed the tracks to where the train had been heading all along, an old Umbrella executive training facility that had been sealed for decades. The training facility had been James Marcus's. It was here, in the 1970s, that he had run his experiments on children. The evidence was still there. Dormitories that had served as something between school housing and containment cells, research notes scattered through the basement levels, the remains of test subjects and chambers that had been locked from the outside. 20 years of darkness had not cleaned the place. It had only let it sit and accumulate the weight of what had happened there, and something was still alive in those sealed corridors. Not alive in any reassuring sense. The leeches that Marcus had infected with the T-virus, the creatures he had used as the foundation for his research, had survived the years of isolation. They had grown and changed and done something that nobody had anticipated. They had aggregated. Hundreds of thousands of individual leeches, infected with the same virus, moving together with coordinated intelligence, forming shapes. One shape in particular, a shape that looked startlingly, unsettlingly like a human being. The creature that confronted Rebecca and Billy believed it was James Marcus, or rather, the aggregated mass of leeches that had absorbed Marcus's genetic material believed it was him, carrying his memories and his grievances in the biological archive of viral tissue that had grown in the sealed laboratory for 2 decades. The figure that moved through the training facility sang, in a strange harmonic way, as though multiple vocal cords were trying to approximate a single voice. It called itself Marcus. It held the shape of Marcus. It remembered being murdered, and it blamed the people responsible, and it blamed Umbrella, and its anger had been building in the dark for 20 years. Rebecca and Billy uncovered the truth of what Marcus had been doing. The children's dormitories, the test subjects, the systematic exploitation of young people, recruited under false pretenses. They discovered the chemical plant below the facility, where T-virus research had continued under less sanitary conditions than the mansion above. They discovered the even deeper laboratory, called Nest, where William Birkin had been conducting his own work on a more advanced viral strain called the G-virus, work that was still in progress as of their arrival. The Queen Leech, the aggregate creature that believed it was Marcus, attacked them repeatedly throughout the facility, sending infected creatures to intercept them, attempting to crush their escape at every turn. The climax came when the self-destruct sequence was activated, designed by Birkin and Wesker to contain the outbreak before it could spread beyond the facility. The Queen Leech confronted them directly, and its one critical vulnerability was the same as any creature built from organisms that had evolved in the dark. It could not tolerate direct sunlight. Rebecca opened the roof. Sunlight poured into the chamber. The Queen Leech collapsed. They escaped the facility as it began to come apart. In the aftermath, standing in the forest with the smoke of a destroyed laboratory rising somewhere behind them, Rebecca made a decision. She had listened to Billy's account of what had really happened in Africa, the mission that had led to his conviction. She believed him. The military tribunal that had sentenced him had not been interested in the truth. And Rebecca was 18 years old and had just watched an Umbrella Corporation facility produce exactly the kind of nightmares that a less idealistic person might have predicted from a company with that many secrets. She took Billy's dog tags. She would file a report stating that Billy Cohen had died in the incident. The investigation would close. He would disappear into the forest, and whatever came next for him would be his own. She watched him walk away into the trees, and then she turned and headed toward the large stone structure she could see through the forest. A mansion, grand and dark, where she believed Enrico Marini and the rest of Bravo team had gone. She had no way of knowing that the mansion was already full of the dead. She had no way of knowing that what she had just survived was only the beginning of what the next 24 hours would bring. The rest of Bravo team had already encountered the Spencer mansion. Most of them would not leave it alive. Chapter 3. The Master of Unlocking. Resident Evil, July 24th, 1998. The following evening, STARS Alpha Team arrived at the Arklay Mountains. Their mission was to locate Bravo Team, which had gone radio silent, and to continue the investigation into the strange events in the forest. The helicopter set them down in a clearing, and they had barely begun to orient themselves when the dogs came. The Cerberus were what happened when Dobermans were infected with the T-virus. They moved faster than they should have. They were not deterred by injuries that would have stopped a normal animal. One of the Alpha Team members, a man named Joseph Frost, was torn apart in the initial moments of the attack. The rest of the team ran. The helicopter pilot, Brad Vickers, panicked and lifted off, leaving his teammates behind. The surviving members of Alpha Team reached the only shelter available, the Spencer Mansion. The team that made it through the front door consisted of 4 people. Captain Albert Wesker, who wore sunglasses regardless of the time of day and spoke in careful, controlled sentences that rarely revealed anything about what he was thinking. Barry Burton, the team's weapons specialist, a man with a family waiting for him at home, and a deep, straightforward decency that made what was about to happen to him particularly painful to watch. Chris Redfield, the team's sharpshooter, stubborn, direct, the kind of person who pushes toward the truth even when smarter people are finding reasons to walk the other way. And Jill Valentine, breaking and entering specialist, formerly trained in bomb disposal, formerly associated with Delta Force before joining STARS, and possessed of a practical, clear-eyed intelligence that would serve her well over the following hours. They split up. This is what everyone always says about horror scenarios. Don't split up. But splitting up in a large building full of unknowns is also just basic tactical procedure, and they were trained professionals, so they split up. And almost immediately, the mansion began to show what it was. The Spencer Mansion was not simply a large house that had been converted into a laboratory entrance. It was a puzzle, an architectural trap. George Trevor had designed it under Spencer's instructions to be genuinely difficult to navigate without specific knowledge. Hidden doors, passages that appeared blocked until a specific switch was thrown, elevator systems that only made sense if you knew what you were looking for, and security systems that locked down sections of the building based on time and code key access. The laboratory beneath the mansion had been designed to be inaccessible to anyone who did not know exactly where to go and what to do when they got there. For a building full of zombies, hunters, and things that had once been research animals but were now something considerably worse, it also had a strange amount of puzzles. This is one of those things about the Resident Evil universe that rewards lateral thinking. The elaborate lock-and-key mechanisms that seem almost theatrical are not just gameplay. They are the deliberate architecture of a man who had designed his private research facility to be impenetrable to outsiders. The Spencer Mansion was meant to be impossible to navigate unless you belonged there. What Chris and Jill found as they worked through the mansion's levels was a progressive, terrible archaeology of what Umbrella had been doing. Dead members of Bravo Team, encountered in rooms and corridors, some of them already reanimated. Kenneth Sullivan, found in the dining room, being consumed by one of the first zombies either of them would ever see. A creature that had been a researcher a few weeks earlier and was now hunger wearing the shape of a man. Forrest Spire, found dead on the terrace, having been shot by the crows that roosted on the mansion's upper levels. Richard Aiken, poisoned by the enormous snake that had been living in the mansion's basement levels since its release from the underground lab. Rebecca Chambers had made it to the mansion. She had arrived during the daylight hours and, exhausted from her night in the Ecliptic Express and the training facility, had fallen asleep in one of the servant dormitory rooms. Richard Aiken had woken her when he arrived, and the two of them had been trying to locate Enrico Marini when the snake found them. Chris or Jill found her there, and she became the 5th surviving member of the team navigating the mansion. able to use her chemistry knowledge to compound treatments and address the various chemical and biological puzzles scattered through the research notes. Enrico Marini was in the caves beneath the mansion, in the tunnel system that connected the main building to the underground laboratory. He had gotten further than anyone else in the team in terms of understanding what was happening. He had deduced that someone in STARS was a traitor working for Umbrella, had been working for Umbrella the whole time, had arranged for both Bravo and Alpha Team to be brought to the mansion specifically. He never got to say the name. A shot rang out in the tunnels. He fell. By the time Chris or Jill reached him, he was dying, and the only thing he managed to communicate was that there was a traitor, that the traitor was close, and that the truth was somewhere in the laboratory below. The laboratory below was reached through the tunnels and through a courtyard garden that had its own collection of horrors, a massive plant creature called Plant 42 that had grown large enough to block an entire wing of the underground complex, feeding on the water that was flooding the basement level from a damaged shark tank. The laboratory itself, Umbrella's clean and carefully maintained research space, full of computer terminals and containment chambers and the precise, organized detritus of systematic biological weapons development, felt almost shockingly normal after the chaos above. This is where they found Wesker. He was already in the laboratory when they arrived. He had been collecting research data, embryonic clone samples of Umbrella's bioorganic weapons, the kind of material that could be sold to the company's rivals or used as the foundation for independent work. He had a plan that had been in motion for years, a plan that required him to appear to die in the Arklay incident while actually surviving in a modified state, a plan that involved the T-virus sample he intended to inject himself with moments before triggering the laboratory's self-destruct sequence. He released the Tyrant, the T-002 as it was designated in the lab documentation, a massive humanoid creature that was the prototype for Umbrella's most ambitious bioorganic weapon program. 8 feet tall, nearly indestructible, with a single enormous claw on one arm that was capable of tearing through solid metal. It moved with a deliberate, almost contemptuous slowness that reflected its absolute confidence in its own superiority to anything it was likely to encounter. It attacked Wesker. This was not what Wesker had intended. He believed the Tyrant would focus on the STARS members, but the creature had been designed to kill humans, and Wesker was a human, and it was not particular about which ones. The Tyrant's claw went through his chest. His heart stopped. He fell. He did not stay fallen, because the T-virus sample he had injected himself with was already working. The specific strain had been modified to interact with his biology in a particular way, not the standard T-virus infection that produced zombies, but an experimental variation that had been tested precisely because of its potential to enhance surviving hosts. His cells were rewriting themselves even as his heart had stopped. He was, in the most clinical possible sense, dying. He was also, in a stranger and more significant sense, becoming something else entirely. Chris and Jill, having watched Wesker fall, activated the laboratory's self-destruct countdown. They collected what survivors they could, Barry, Rebecca, and headed for the surface. On the helipad at the top of the mansion, Brad Vickers arrived with the helicopter, guilt presumably having overcome panic somewhere over the previous several hours. They climbed aboard, and then the self-destruct sequence's final alarm sounded, and the Tyrant came through the helipad's surface hatch. Because, of course, it did, still functional despite the massive damage it had sustained in the laboratory below. Brad dropped a rocket launcher. One of the team caught it. The Tyrant was destroyed. The mansion below them began to come apart in a chain of explosions that lit up the Arklay Mountains like a second sunrise. Alpha Team escaped. 4 survivors: Chris, Jill, Barry, and Rebecca. Brad Vickers made it too, technically, though his standing with the team following his earlier departure was complicated. Wesker was presumed dead in the explosion. He was not dead. He was changing. Back at Raccoon City, STARS was disbanded by Police Chief Brian Irons, who had been on Umbrella's payroll for years and was not interested in allowing the survivors to pursue their investigation. Chris Redfield left the city almost immediately, heading for Europe on the trail of evidence he had collected in the mansion laboratory. Barry and Rebecca departed separately. Jill and Brad Vickers remained in Raccoon City, trying to gather more evidence, working in what had become a hostile environment. A city where the police department was compromised and the corporation responsible for the massacre in the mountains was an important institutional donor. 2 months would pass. 2 months during which the T-virus continued doing what it did, quietly in ways that most of Raccoon City's residents knew nothing about. Chapter 4: The City Falls. Resident Evil 2, September 29th, 1998. There is something specific about the night of September 29th, 1998, in Raccoon City that the Resident Evil games convey better than any pure description can. The sense of arriving somewhere that has already ended. The quietness of streets that should be busy, the overturned cars and abandoned belongings that speak of people who had been somewhere and then suddenly were not. Raccoon City, a mid-sized American city in the Arklay Mountains region, had a population of approximately 100,000 people. By the time the sun went down on September 29th, the vast majority of them were dead or dying or had already become something other than what they had been. The T-virus that had destroyed the Spencer Mansion laboratory had not stayed in the laboratory. Umbrella's disposal practices for contaminated materials had been, to put it charitably, insufficient. Biological waste from the Arklay facility had been entering the city's water supply in small quantities for months. The infection had spread slowly at first, below the threshold of easy detection, producing illnesses that local physicians attributed to seasonal viruses or food contamination. Then it reached the threshold beyond which slow became fast, and fast became catastrophic. And catastrophic became what a military blockade encountered when it tried to establish a containment perimeter and discovered the perimeter was already compromised. 2 people arrived in Raccoon City that night from outside, both of them unaware of what they were driving into. Leon Scott Kennedy had been hired by the Raccoon City Police Department. His first day on the job was September 29th. He had driven through the night, running late, hungover from what would turn out to be his last proper night of sleep for quite some time. He was 21 years old, newly out of police academy, with textbook training in law enforcement that was about to become irrelevant and no particular experience with anything that could have prepared him for what he drove into, as he crossed the city limits and the streets stopped being empty and started being full. Claire Redfield arrived on a motorcycle. She was 19 years old, a university student, the younger sister of Chris Redfield. Chris had left for Europe 2 months earlier to follow Umbrella's trail, and he had not been in contact since. Claire was not the kind of person who sat with an unanswered question if she had the means to go looking for answers. She had driven to Raccoon City to find her brother. She stopped at a diner on the north side of the city. It was too late by then for anyone to stop her at the outskirts, and found it empty except for zombies. They found each other almost immediately, as people in crisis tend to when they are both the kind of person who moves toward other people rather than away from them. Leon and Claire, a rookie cop and a college student. They commandeered an RPD cruiser and headed for the police station, and whatever chance they had of making it through the city quietly was ended when a zombie that had been hiding in the back seat made itself known, and the resulting crash involved a gasoline truck and a substantial explosion, and they were separated in the burning aftermath. What followed over the course of that night and the following day was the complete unraveling of everything Umbrella had been keeping hidden in Raccoon City. The police station was as overrun as the rest of the city, but it was a large building with heavy doors, and it had some structural integrity left, which made it a useful base of operations for anyone trying to survive. Leon found a surviving officer named Marvin Branagh, shot and dying in the West Office, who told him what little he knew about the STARS investigation and the Arklay incidents. Claire found the police chief's office and found Chief Irons himself, Brian Irons, the man who had disbanded STARS and suppressed the evidence of Umbrella's activities, now barricaded in his office with the guilty knowledge of everything he had helped conceal. The station was connected by underground passages to a sewage system that connected to a chemical plant that connected to a deeper underground laboratory designated Nest. Umbrella's secondary facility beneath the city, where a researcher named William Birkin had spent years working on the next phase of the viral program. Birkin was brilliant in the way that genuinely makes people dangerous. He had been at Umbrella since his early teens, recruited young, trained in the company's own programs, given resources and latitude that no legitimate institution would ever have provided, and that produced results that no ethical research program could have sanctioned. His work on the G-virus, a mutagenic agent derived from the G-virus sample he had isolated from a unique test subject years earlier, had produced something theoretically far more powerful than the T-virus. Where the T-virus replaced and reanimated, the G-virus transformed, It took a living host and rewrote it continuously into something of expanding biological complexity. It did not produce predictable mutations. It produced a cascade of adaptations, each one building on the last, pushing the host towards something that had no natural endpoint. Umbrella sent people to take Birkin's samples. The Umbrella Special Service Unit, armed, professional, completely indifferent to Birkin's insistence that the research was not ready to be transferred, shot him and took his work. But Birkin, dying on the floor of his own laboratory with the sample case in his hands, injected himself with his own creation. The G-virus did what it did. William Birkin did not die in that laboratory. Something that had been William Birkin got up and destroyed the USS team that had shot him, and several of the flesh wounds that were sustained in that confrontation introduced the T-virus into the city's drainage system through the blood that was left behind. The creature that Birkin had become pursued Leon and Claire through the sewers and the chemical plant with the specific fixation that a creature retaining fragments of human memory sometimes shows. He was not hunting them because he was hungry. He was hunting them because somewhere in the mass of mutations that had overtaken his biology, the word daughter still produced a response. His daughter, Sherry Birkin, was somewhere in the city. Claire found Sherry first, a 12-year-old girl hiding in the police station, separated from parents who had been too focused on their work to keep her as safe as she deserved to be, carrying without knowing it a G-virus embryo that her father had forced upon her. The creature that her father had become was not trying to hurt her. It was trying to share something with her, in the only language it still had access to, the biological language of the G-virus, which implanted copies of itself in other organisms to ensure its own propagation. The horror of Resident Evil 2 is very specifically the horror of watching someone's humanity be stripped from them by degrees and seeing what remains still reaching toward the people they loved. Leon met Ada Wong in the sewers. She told him she was a civilian looking for her boyfriend, a researcher named John who worked for Umbrella. She was not a civilian looking for her boyfriend. She was an operative working for one of Umbrella's rivals, sent to acquire a sample of the G-virus. But she was also, despite everything, a person. And Leon was someone she found herself unwilling to allow to die, even when the mission required her to prioritize the sample over his survival. Police Chief Irons was killed by the creature Birkin had become, the G-virus embryo he had been carrying bursting through his chest, in a way that was both scientifically coherent and deeply, viscerally disturbing. Annette Birkin, William's wife, appeared in the tunnels, not transformed, still human, but carrying the particular kind of damage that comes from knowing exactly what you were part of building and watching it destroy everything anyway. She died in the underground laboratory trying to give Leon and Claire the information they needed. The final confrontation happened on an Umbrella evacuation train running underneath the city. William Birkin, having undergone multiple mutation cycles since the first injection in his laboratory, had become something that barely retained any of the shape he had started with. It attacked the train. It was defeated ultimately when the train exploded at the end of its underground run, the detonation finally consuming what multiple gunfights had not. Leon, Claire, and Sherry escaped on foot from the burning tunnel. They were picked up by an Umbrella vehicle, more specifically, by a man working in the anti-Umbrella intelligence community who had been tracking the Raccoon City incident from outside. Leon was offered a position. He accepted, because accepting meant access to resources that might eventually help him find the people responsible for what he had just lived through. Claire and Sherry needed to find Chris. And finding Chris meant following the evidence to Europe, which meant infiltrating Umbrella's Paris laboratory, which led directly to the chain of events that would take Claire to Rockford Island and eventually to Antarctica. Jill Valentine was still in the city. This detail belongs to the next chapter of the story, because what happened to Jill in the days before the evacuation train ran its final course is its own narrative, one that involves a creature that had been engineered specifically to hunt her, and a city that was about to be officially erased from the map. Chapter 5. Nemesis. Resident Evil 3, September 1998. The Nemesis is not like the Tyrant. The Tyrant program had produced powerful creatures, massive and nearly indestructible, but they were fundamentally reactive. They attacked what was in front of them, without specific targeting, without the capacity for sustained pursuit or tactical adaptation. The T-002 in the Spencer mansion had been a weapon in the truest sense. Point it at the enemy and let it do what it was built to do, and stay out of its path yourself. Nemesis was different. The Nemesis T-type was a tyrant-class organism that had been implanted with a secondary parasite called the Ne-alpha parasite, which bonded with and modified the tyrant's already substantial neural tissue to produce something that the standard models entirely lacked: purpose. Nemesis had an objective, not an instinct, not an appetite, an objective. It had been given a target list, the surviving members of STAR's Alpha team, and it had been instructed to find them and eliminate them in order to prevent further investigation of the Arklay incidents. It was the size of a large man, though everything about its proportions was wrong. Its coat and the heavy equipment it carried initially suggested something almost human about its outline, until you got close enough to see the face. It spoke one word, just the one, over and over with an insistent rumbling clarity that cut through background noise the way important sounds do when your body knows they mean danger. It said Nemesis, which was both its designation and, in some dark poetic way, exactly what it represented. It said the word while carrying a rocket launcher. It said the word when it burst through walls. It said the word when it got back up from things that should have ended it. The Nemesis was the game's central horror, not because of what it could do to you physically, though that was considerable, but because of what it represented. The moment when the thing hunting you acquires the capacity to learn from its previous attempts and adjust accordingly. Jill Valentine had been trying to leave Raccoon City for days. The city had been falling apart in stages, the T-virus spreading through the population at a pace that outran the capacity of any official response to contain it. Jill knew what was happening, and knew why it was happening in a way that most of the city's residents did not, which was both an advantage, she understood the threat clearly, and a burden, because understanding a threat clearly sometimes just means being able to articulate precisely how serious the situation is without being able to change it. She had been working with a man named Carlos Oliveira, a mercenary employed by Umbrella's Biohazard Countermeasures Service. Carlos was young, idealistic in the particular way that people who have worked in morally complex environments sometimes are, operating under the belief that he was doing something useful until the evidence that he was working for the architects of the disaster became too overwhelming to rationalize. He had colleagues, fellow mercenaries deployed into the city with the nominal mission of assisting with civilian evacuation, who died one by one as the city became less survivable. Jill was infected. The Nemesis injected her with a modified T-virus at some point during one of their encounters, and she spent time in a feverish, half-conscious state while Carlos worked to find the vaccine that could address the specific strains she had been exposed to. The hospital in the city's center, still partially functional, still stocked with the research materials that an Umbrella-affiliated medical facility would have had access to, became the site of Carlos's desperate search for the materials needed to compound an antiviral treatment. He found it. He brought it back. Jill recovered. The Raccoon City destruction incident, the official name for what happened next, was not an accident, not an emergent decision made by someone in the moment. It was a plan that had been in place since before the outbreak, a contingency designed to ensure that the evidence of what Umbrella had done could be destroyed along with the city that contained it. On October 1st, 1998, the United States government, acting on authorization from the highest level, with the full knowledge of what Raccoon City contained and what destroying it would mean, launched a missile strike against the city. 100,000 people. The missile did not distinguish between the living and the dead, between the infected and the ones who had spent the previous week trying to survive an outbreak that was entirely not their fault. The city burned and collapsed into itself, and the T-virus and the evidence of everything Umbrella had done there were consumed in the same fire. Jill and Carlos escaped. Brad Vickers did not. The Nemesis had found him before Jill reached him, and Brad's chapter in the story ended in a Raccoon City street. The Nemesis itself was destroyed in the final confrontation at an abandoned factory at the edge of the city, a confrontation that Jill survived through a combination of tactical improvisation and the kind of determination that comes from having been hunted by something for days and envisioning at some point that the hunting stops here. Jill and Carlos got out on a helicopter as the missiles came down behind them. The specific image of it, the two of them in the sky, the city below them dissolving into fire, the sound of 100,000 lives ending in a fraction of a second, is one the franchise never returns to directly, because some things do not need to be revisited. They carry themselves. the Nemesis was destroyed by a railgun that Jill found in the factory's ruins. The device was left behind by Umbrella's own cleanup crews, who had been dispatched to the city to retrieve research materials and eliminate surviving threats before the government's decisive action rendered their work moot. The fact that they left behind equipment powerful enough to destroy one of their own premium bioweapons says something about how chaotic the final days of Raccoon City truly were. Umbrella's own institutional response was falling apart along with everything else. There is something deeply worth noting about the way Resident Evil 3 treats Jill Valentine that gets lost when people focus primarily on the horror of the Nemesis. Jill spends the entire game making choices. She chooses to stay in Raccoon City when she could have left earlier. She chooses to help Carlos when survival logic might suggest focusing on herself. She chooses to fight rather than flee at multiple critical moments. The Nemesis is not simply a monster that happens to her. It is a test of whether all the things that made her who she was, the training, the intelligence, the refusal to be diminished by extraordinary circumstances, would hold when the most extreme possible pressure was applied to them. They held. That is the story. The destruction of Raccoon City was the beginning of the end for Umbrella Corporation as a public entity, a pharmaceutical company that had allowed a city of 100,000 people to be infected with its biological weapons, necessitating the government destruction of an entire American city, was not a pharmaceutical company that could survive the scrutiny that followed. The lawsuits, the investigations, the congressional hearings, the international pressure, all of it began accumulating in the months after October 1st, 1998. Umbrella's lawyers fought back, and the company was enormous enough to absorb the initial wave of legal attacks. But the foundation had been cracked in ways that would eventually prove fatal to the corporation. Not immediately, though. Umbrella still had facilities. It still had researchers. It still had Albert Wesker, who had survived the Spencer mansion and was now pursuing his own agenda with the enhanced capabilities he had acquired during his T-virus transformation. The corporation would take another 5 years to finally collapse. And in the meantime, the research continued in other places, in other forms. On an island in the South Pacific, in the files of a company called the HCF, and in the private ambitions of a researcher's daughter who had spent 15 years in a cryogenic sleep waiting for the moment to emerge. Chapter 6, Ice and Blood. Code Veronica, December 1998. 3 months after the destruction of Raccoon City, Claire Redfield was in Paris. She had been moving since she and Leon parted ways in the tunnel beneath the burning city, following the evidence trail that pointed toward Umbrella's European operations. She believed Chris might have gone to Umbrella's facility in Paris, or that the Paris facility might have records of where he actually was. She infiltrated the facility. She was captured almost immediately. Umbrella's European security apparatus was more functional than its American counterpart had been just before everything fell apart, and a 19-year-old student who had broken into a heavily guarded research installation was not going to slip through unnoticed. She was transported to Rockford Island. Rockford Island was a private island in the South Pacific, owned by the Ashford family, specifically by Alfred Ashford, 7th Earl Ashford, who had inherited both the title and the island's military-grade security installations following his father Alexander's death. Alfred was, to put it charitably, unstable. The island served as both a private military training facility for Umbrella's overseas operations and a prison of a particular kind, a place where people who knew things Umbrella did not want communicated were kept in a state of indefinite detention, away from any legal system that might intervene on their behalf. Claire arrived on the island at the same moment that someone else was attacking it. Albert Wesker had been building an organization since his apparent death in the Spencer Mansion laboratory. His enhanced physical capabilities, the T-virus modification had given him speed and strength that made him functionally superhuman, as well as a self-repair mechanism that made conventional injuries recoverable within seconds. Combined with decades of Umbrella intelligence knowledge made him extraordinarily valuable to anyone interested in the post-Umbrella bioweapons market. He had gathered a private military force called the HCF, the Hive/Host Capture Force, and was using it to pursue his own agenda, which included the acquisition of research data and biological samples that had not made it into Umbrella's standard holdings. The HCF attacked Rockford Island to acquire one specific thing: Alexia Ashford. Alexia was Alfred's twin sister, and she was remarkable in the specific way that rare brilliance in a particular field, combined with profound ethical disregard, sometimes produces remarkable results. She had been working on a variant of the T virus derived from ancient biological material, a strain she called the T. veronica virus, developed using genetic material from the veronica strain that had been preserved in the Ashford family's research records. The T. veronica virus represented something the T virus had never achieved: stable, controllable mutation. The host could potentially direct their own biological transformation rather than being directed by the virus. The trade-off was that the process required 15 years. At the age of 12, Alexia had injected herself with the T. veronica virus and directed her own body to be placed in a cryogenic sleep chamber. The 15 years were nearly up when the HCF arrived. Claire navigated Rockford Island with the help of a young prisoner named Steve Burnside, whose father had sold umbrella secrets on the black market, and whose punishment had been imprisonment on an island with no legal recourse, and a commander who was losing his grip on reality. Steve was 17, brash in the way of people who have been trying to convince themselves they are not frightened, and carrying enough genuine pain beneath the bravado that Claire recognized him almost immediately as someone worth protecting. Alfred Ashford, trying to defend his island from the HCF attack and prevent the awakening of his sister, escalated everything in ways that served nobody's interests. He was killed in Antarctica, having led Claire and Steve there as the island fell. And in the Antarctic base, the cryogenic sleep ended. Alexia Ashford, at 27 years old, was extraordinary. The 15 years of controlled viral integration had produced mutations she could direct and express deliberately. She could generate extraordinary heat, control insect swarms, reshape her own biology with a precision that made the random mutations of the standard T virus look crude by comparison. She was also, by any measure, not entirely sane anymore. The 15 years had done things to her perception of time and human connection that made her feel more like a force of nature than a person. Chris Redfield arrived in Antarctica. Leon Kennedy had contacted him, passing along the message that Claire needed help, getting her location, enabling Chris to chart a course across the world to reach his sister. The reunion was brief and practical, which is how they both operate. There were more pressing concerns. Alexia needed to be stopped before she could use the T. veronica virus in the way she intended, and Wesker needed to be confronted. Their first confrontation, Wesker and Chris, in the Antarctic facility, established the shape of a rivalry that would define the next decade of the franchise. Wesker was faster than Chris by a margin that made conventional combat tactics inadequate. He moved across the room in flashes of speed that the eye could barely track. He was amused by the situation in a way that genuine contempt sometimes looks like amusement. He let Chris live because killing him immediately was less interesting than letting the rivalry continue. Steve Burnside died in Antarctica. He had been infected with the T. veronica virus by Alexia in the final stages of the battle, his body beginning the transformation that the virus produced in hosts who were not prepared for it. He died in Claire's arms with enough of his humanity intact to tell her what he needed to tell her before the virus claimed the last of him. Claire carried that loss with her when she and Chris escaped the self-destructing Antarctic base. There is a particular kind of grief that attaches to people who die young in circumstances they did not choose, and Steve Burnside is one of the franchise's most quietly affecting tragedies because he had done nothing to deserve his position. His father had sold Umbrella's secrets for money, which was a moral failing of a specific, ordinary kind. Not ideology or ambition, but just the banal human appetite for an easier life. The decision to monetize knowledge that was not his to sell. Steve had paid for his father's choices with years of imprisonment on an island in the South Pacific, in the care of a man who was losing his grip on sanity, surrounded by the infrastructure of an organization that had treated his family as disposable. And then he had been one of the good ones, brave and brash and a little reckless in the way of people who have learned that caution is no guarantee of safety. He had helped Claire at every point where helping was possible, and the T. veronica virus had taken him anyway. Alexia Ashford herself is one of the most fascinating antagonists in the franchise's history, partly because her intelligence was genuine. The T. veronica virus represented a real scientific achievement. 15 years of controlled viral integration, producing mutations that could be expressed deliberately rather than randomly, was something that no other researcher in the franchise had managed. The trade-off was that it required 15 years of cryogenic sleep and the willingness to treat your own body as a laboratory, which required a particular relationship with the concept of personal risk. Alexia had that relationship. She had also emerged from those 15 years with a relationship to time and other people that no longer resembled what a normal human mind produces. She understood the research with perfect clarity. Everything else had become secondary. The Antarctic base's self-destruct was triggered in the chaos of the final confrontation. Chris and Claire were outside the building, having escaped through the chaos of the battle's conclusion. The ice and snow of Antarctica spread in every direction, cold and indifferent and entirely uninterested in the survival of the people who had just spent the last several hours fighting through the consequences of other people's decisions. They had survived Code Veronica, as the incident was later named in official documentation. Umbrella had lost another facility. Wesker had not gotten what he came for. Alexia had been killed before she could be captured and studied, and the T. Veronica research had been largely destroyed with the Antarctic base. But Wesker had patience. He had time, and he had been watching Chris fight for years now, cataloging capabilities, measuring the gap between them, deciding what he wanted from the inevitable next encounter. Chapter 7. A Village in Spain. Resident Evil 4. Autumn 2004. 6 years is a long time for a world to change. And the world of Resident Evil changed considerably between the fall of Raccoon City in 1998 and autumn of 2004. Umbrella Corporation, after years of legal battles, congressional hearings, and the drip-drip erosion of public trust that comes when a company is repeatedly connected to catastrophic biological events, finally collapsed in 2003. Its assets were seized, its facilities shuttered, its researchers scattered to the winds of post-Umbrella pharmaceutical and bioweapon development. The knowledge that Umbrella had generated did not disappear with the corporation. It fragmented, distributed itself through the various organizations that had been watching the company's research output and waiting for the moment when they could acquire pieces of it. The world had a bioterrorism problem that was no longer localized to one company's activities. The data had escaped, the methodologies were in circulation, and the organizations that arose to deal with bioterrorism, government units, private security contractors, international coalitions, were perpetually behind the curve of what was being developed in laboratories they did not know existed. Leon Scott Kennedy had spent the 6 years since Raccoon City in the service of the United States government's classified anti-bioterrorism division. The trauma of his first day as a police officer had been processed, more or less, into a set of capabilities that made him extraordinarily effective at doing a very specific job. He could operate in environments where biological threats were present without the paralysis that would consume most people. He understood the kind of thinking that produced bioweapons programs because he had walked through the physical spaces those programs created. He was, by 2004, one of the most practically experienced bioterrorism field agents in the world, which was an accomplishment that came with a weight that he managed through dark humor and a particular kind of emotional compartmentalization. He was sent to Spain. The president's daughter had been kidnapped. Ashley Graham, university student, daughter of the current commander-in-chief, entirely unprepared for the Spanish countryside as a setting for a bioterrorism incident, had been taken from her car by individuals connected to a cult called Los Iluminados. The cult operated out of a mountainous rural region called Valdelobos, in a setting that the word remote does not adequately capture. Ancient stone architecture, isolated farmlands, a community that had been present in this valley for generations and that had, at some point in the recent past, been thoroughly infiltrated by a man named Osmond Sadler with ideas about what the people of this valley could become. Las Plagas was ancient. Not as ancient as the progenitor virus, perhaps, but old enough that its origins had been lost to local legend. A parasitic organism that had been sealed underground centuries ago, presumably by a community that had discovered what it did to human hosts and had decided that sealing it underground was preferable to the alternative. The seal had held, and then Los Iluminados had gone looking for it. Unlike the T-virus, which consumed its host's intelligence along with much else, Las Plagas produced a different kind of transformation. The parasite implanted within a host and spread its tissue through the nervous system, eventually reaching the brain. The cognitive degradation was real but partial. Infected individuals, called ganados, retained enough intelligence to use tools, follow complex orders, and coordinate in groups. They were not zombies in any traditional sense. They were people whose autonomy had been transferred to whoever controlled the dominant strain of the parasite. Sadler controlled the dominant strain. And what Sadler wanted, what Los Illuminados wanted, was leverage over the most powerful government in the world. An infected president's daughter, returned home with the parasite growing inside her, could be triggered at a moment of Sadler's choosing. The people she influenced, the access she had, the cascade of political consequences that could follow from that access being placed under external control. Leon arrived in a jeep with 2 Spanish police officers who did not make it past the initial encounter with the village. The villagers were not welcoming. They were not frightened of him. They were not anything he recognized from his years of training and field experience. They were coordinated and purposeful and completely undeterred by the kinds of warnings that would have stopped ordinary criminals. And when the village chief appeared, Betoris Mendez, enormous and wrong in the way that someone with a parasite in their nervous system and a host body that has begun adapting to it is wrong, Leon found himself very quickly on the losing end of a group confrontation. He woke up tied to the floor, back to back with a man named Luis Serra. Luis was a former researcher. He had worked for Los Illuminados as a scientist before the nature of what he was contributing to had become clear enough that he had begun trying to extract himself from the situation and was now in a position that politely might be described as precarious. He and Leon escaped the immediate problem together and went their separate ways in the way that people do when they are both trying to solve different parts of the same larger crisis. The castle that dominated the valley's higher ground belonged to Ramon Salazar. The Salazar family had been the original noble house associated with Los Illuminados, and the current scion, a small and elaborate figure who compensated for his size with extraordinary architectural over-design, had given Sadler full use of the castle's considerable defensive infrastructure. Ashley was being held within it. Leon worked his way through the castle's levels, through the cellars where Las Plagas specimens were being cultivated, through the towers where Salazar waited with the theatrical confidence of someone who had never been truly tested. Ada Wong appeared. She was not working for Leon. She was not working for Sadler. She was working for the same unnamed organization that had employed her in Raccoon City, and what that organization wanted was a sample of the dominant Las Plagas parasite, the strain that Sadler controlled that would theoretically give its possessor the same leverage of leverage over ganado populations that Sadler currently held. Her presence complicated everything and saved Leon's life on several occasions. Whether those two facts balanced out depended on how you counted. The island facility. That was where the research had been consolidated, where the more advanced experiments were being conducted, where the specialized medical equipment that could remove a Las Plagas parasite from an infected host without killing the host had been built by Luis Serra before he was killed by Sadler for knowing too much. Leon found Ashley there. They removed the parasites from their own bodies using the machine Luis had built. They escaped in a jet ski as the island's self-destruct sequence counted down around them, because Resident Evil facilities very consistently have self-destruct sequences, and they very consistently activate them at the climactic moment. Ada Wong escorted Sadler to his own death by throwing Leon a special rocket launcher and disappearing in a helicopter sent by Wesker. The sample she took with her would eventually reach an organization that knew precisely what to do with it, contributing to the next phase of the bioweapons proliferation that the post-Umbrella world was struggling to contain. The Ada Wong situation deserves more attention than the main game's plot necessarily stops to give it, because what Ada represents in this chapter of the story is the fully matured version of a theme that runs through the entire franchise. She is someone operating in the space between genuine human connection and institutional loyalty, and the franchise is never quite willing to resolve which one wins. She and Leon have a history that Resident Evil 2 established in the Raccoon City sewers, a connection that formed in impossibly compressed circumstances, and that neither of them has fully processed in the 6 years since. She saves his life in Resident Evil 4 more times than the game stops to count. She also steals the Las Plagas sample at gunpoint and leaves him stranded on an exploding island. The version of the world that would describe her as a villain is not wrong. The version that would describe her as someone doing difficult work under extraordinarily complicated constraints is also not wrong. Ada herself seems most comfortable in the space where both things are simultaneously true. Jack Krauser is the other significant presence in this chapter, and his significance is specifically the significance of someone who illustrates what happens to people when the institutions they serve fail them. Krauser had been Leon's training partner in government service. He was genuinely skilled, genuinely dedicated, and then had been injured during a mission and had been discarded by the government that employed him in ways that the government discards people when they are no longer useful, efficiently, without ceremony, in language designed to minimize any ongoing obligation. He had gone looking for someone who would take him seriously. Wesker had, and Wesker had then directed him to Sadler, who had provided the Las Plagas infection that gave Krauser new capabilities, new purpose, and the particular moral isolation of someone who has decided that the betrayal they experienced justified the betrayals they subsequently committed. He was wrong about that. The franchise makes that clear. But the path from legitimate grievance to monstrous choices is not always as long as we might like to believe. Leon had his victory, Ashley was safe, the cult was destroyed, the immediate threat to the president was resolved, but the knowledge of Las Plagas was in circulation now, and the sample Ada had recovered was on its way to hands that would use it in ways that Sadler, for all his ambitions, had never envisioned. Chapter 8, The Last War with Wesker, Resident Evil 5, March 2009. By 2009, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance had been in operation for 6 years. The BSAA had been founded by Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, among others, in the years following Umbrella's collapse, specifically because the collapse had distributed Umbrella's research across dozens of successor organizations, and the world needed something that could respond to bioterrorism incidents faster and with more expertise than existing law enforcement or military structures could manage. The BSAA operated under United Nations authorization, funded by a coalition of governments, and had quickly become the primary international body for addressing biological incidents of the kind that had been increasing in frequency since the late 1990s. Chris Redfield was one of the BSAA's most experienced field agents. He had been involved in operations in Russia, in various parts of Europe, in any number of places where the echo of Umbrella's research was still producing consequences. He had spent most of the decade since Raccoon City working with the particular relentless quality of someone who has made their work into an answer to grief. The dead in the Spencer mansion, the dead in Raccoon City, the dead in Antarctica. If you stopped working, you had to find some other way to process the accumulation, and working was easier. Jill Valentine had been confirmed dead in 2006. She and Chris had tracked down Oswell Spencer, the founder of Umbrella, who had spent years in hiding as the company he had built collapsed around him, to a private estate in Europe. They had arrived too late to find Spencer alive. Wesker had already been there. Spencer was dead at his desk, and Wesker was waiting for them with a calm that indicated he had expected this visit eventually. The fight that followed had not been close. Wesker's enhanced capabilities had improved further in the years since the Spencer mansion, and he moved through the combat with something close to contempt for the gap between what he could do and what Chris and Jill could do to stop him. Jill had saved Chris by throwing herself at Wesker, driving both of them through a window overlooking a sheer drop. Neither body was recovered. Chris had spent 3 years looking and finding nothing, and eventually arriving at a kind of professional acknowledgement that she was gone, even as something in him refused to entirely accept it. She was not dead. The mission to West Africa began as a bioweapon trafficking interdiction. The Kajuju Autonomous Zone was a region with its own complicated political history, and the combination of that history and the presence of a black market arms dealer named Ricardo Irving had produced an environment that the BSAA's West African branch could not manage alone. Chris was deployed with a new partner, Shiva Alamar, a West African BSAA agent with her own particular history, with bioterrorism's impact on communities that lacked the infrastructure to survive it. The Magini were what Los Illuminados would look like if the same parasitic technology was deployed in a different cultural and geographic context. People infected with a variant of Las Plagas, cooperative and coordinated, directed toward violence with a completeness that left no room for the individual personalities they had once possessed. They flooded the streets of Kijuju's settlements, making the city's already difficult political landscape into something approaching a war zone. Chris and Sheva found the memory card among the intelligence they recovered from the early engagement, Among the surveillance photographs it contained was an image of a woman in a hooded combat uniform. The face was obscured, but the body proportions, the way the figure held itself. Chris had been looking at that set of physical characteristics across the table from him for years. He knew it was Jill before any analysis confirmed it. She was not Jill in any complete sense, not the person she had been before 2006. What Wesker had done with the 3 years he had possession of her was a violation of the most precise kind. The antibodies that Jill's immune system had produced in response to her original T-virus exposure at the hands of the Nemesis were, it turned out, precisely what Wesker needed to formulate a new viral strain. The Ouroboros virus was built from the biological material of a person who had survived something that was supposed to be unsurvivable, repurposed into a weapon that had no interest in the survival of anyone it encountered. And Jill had been kept alive to provide that material, and then had been put back into the field with a mind control device embedded in her chest, and a new identity as one of Wesker's most effective operatives. The device administered a chemical called P30, which enhanced Jill's physical capabilities far beyond her already considerable baseline, while maintaining her under Wesker's influence. She fought with a precision and intensity that made her genuinely dangerous to Chris and Sheva. And the particular horror of that encounter, a person you love trying to kill you with skills you help them develop, and you cannot stop them because stopping them means hurting them, is one of the most emotionally specific moments in the franchise's history. They removed the device. Jill recovered, slowly, painfully, the chemistry that had been controlling her flushing out of her system in the aftermath of the device's removal. She told them to go. She told them she would be all right. She told Chris not to trust his partner if he lost her again, which was simultaneously practical advice and a terrible thing to have to say. Wesker's plan involved an airship and missiles. The Ouroboros virus, packaged for aerial dispersal, targeted to saturate the atmosphere over a significant portion of the globe. The vision was the same one he had articulated in various forms since the Spencer Mansion. A forced evolutionary event. A thinning of the human population to those rare individuals whose biology could survive and adapt. A new kind of humanity purified through catastrophe. The scale had simply grown with his resources and his ambitions, and with 15 years of accumulated rage at a world that had not yet recognized what he believed he was. Chris and Sheva followed him to the airship. They followed him to a volcano when the airship was brought down. They fought him at the edge of a lava flow, in conditions that should have been unsurvivable, in a confrontation that the entire franchise had been building towards since the Spencer Mansion, when Wesker had first let Chris live, because killing him immediately was less interesting. The Ouroboros virus, injected directly into Wesker's own system, had given him a dramatic but unstable power increase. His tissue had begun the Ouroboros transformation, adding mass and strength and the ability to manifest the virus's characteristic tendrils, but at the cost of what remained of his biological stability. He was coming apart even as he fought. The volcano's heat provided an opportunity that the cold mathematics of their options made clear. 2 rocket-propelled grenades. Jill and Josh Stone in a helicopter above, Josh having extracted himself from the earlier battle with Magini, Jill having recovered enough to guide the aircraft. A ladder dropped from the hovering vehicle. Chris and Sheva had approximately 4 seconds to decide between climbing and firing. 2 rocket-propelled grenades. Jill and Josh Stone in a helicopter above, Josh having extracted himself from the earlier battle with Magini, Jill having recovered enough to guide the aircraft. A ladder dropped from the hovering vehicle. Chris and Sheva had approximately 4 seconds to decide between climbing and firing. They fired. Wesker fell into the lava. And in the quiet that followed, in the helicopter with the volcano receding below them, Chris Redfield was left to figure out what he was supposed to do with himself, in a world where the primary organizing principle of his adult life was suddenly, definitively gone. It is worth pausing here on what Wesker had actually been trying to do, because the franchise sometimes presents his plan in ways that make it seem like cartoonish megalomania. It is that. But it is also something more uncomfortable. Wesker believed, with the specific conviction of someone who had been studying human history and human biology for decades, that the human species was on a trajectory towards self-destruction. War, environmental collapse, the political systems that produced them. He saw all of it as evidence of an organism that had exceeded the evolutionary design parameters that had produced it. The solution he had arrived at was brutal and did not survive serious ethical scrutiny. But the underlying observation, that humanity had serious structural problems, was not entirely without foundation. What made Wesker monstrous was not the observation, but the conclusion he drew from it, that the solution to human limitation was to reduce the human population to those rare individuals whose biology could accommodate the Ouroboros virus, and to then rule over whatever emerged from that reduction. He had exempted himself from the category of limitation. He had looked at a world of 8 billion people and concluded that he was the appropriate person to decide which of them were worthy of continuation. The arrogance of that conclusion was so vast that it came back around to something that looked, from certain angles, like a kind of madness. The Tricell Corporation, the company that had been funding the BSAA while simultaneously continuing Umbrella's research in the facility below the Kajuju marshes, was exactly the institutional pattern repeating itself, founded on legitimate pharmaceutical research, using that legitimacy to fund classified biological work, acquiring Umbrella's research data after the corporation's collapse, providing cover for Wesker's plans while pursuing its own version of the post-Umbrella bioweapon market. Excellagione, the CEO, who had partnered with Wesker in the belief that his plan would benefit her personally, was consumed by the Ouroboros virus when she was no longer useful to him. A fate that illustrated the specific problem with placing your trust in someone who has already decided that most people are expendable. The answer for a while was keep working, keep fighting, keep being useful. This is both healthy and insufficient, and the consequences of that insufficiency would surface a few years later in a place called Edonia, in an incident that involved a virus called C-virus and a partner named Piers Nivens, and a crisis of identity that very nearly consumed Chris Redfield entirely. But that chapter belongs to a different story than this one. Tonight, we are following the thread that leads to the final act. Chapter 9, The Swamp in Louisiana, Resident Evil 7, Biohazard, July 2017, 19 years after Raccoon City, 14 years after Umbrella's collapse, 8 years after Albert Wesker went into a volcano in West Africa. The world of Resident Evil had changed in all the ways that worlds change when the immediate crisis has passed. The organizations that had been shaped by the crisis continued operating, but with different emphases, different threats, different funding battles. The BSAA continued. Leon Kennedy continued. The bioweapon knowledge continued to circulate, mutate, find new applications in new hands. And somewhere in the bayou country of Dulvey, Louisiana, something had been growing quietly for 3 years. Ethan Winters was not a soldier. He was not a special agent or a trained operative or a veteran of bioterrorism incidents. He was a systems engineer, 29 years old. The kind of ordinary person the Resident Evil series occasionally remembers exists in the world that its extraordinary people move through. He had been married to Mia for several years, and 3 years ago, Mia had gone on a work trip and had not come back. She had been declared dead after an extended search produced no evidence of her whereabouts. And then Ethan received an email. It was from Mia. It was fragmentary and strange, and told him she was in Louisiana and asked him to find her and not to look for her. Those two things coexisting in a message that read like something written by someone who was not entirely in control of what they were expressing. Ethan drove to Louisiana, found the address she had mentioned in the email, and arrived at a farmhouse that should have been abandoned. Mia was in the basement. What had been living with Mia in the Dulvey Bayou for 3 years was a child named Evelyn, who was 10 years old in appearance but considerably older in terms of how long she had been engineered, and who was a bioweapon, the most sophisticated bioweapon that an organization called The Connections had ever produced. Evelyn was designated E-001, the first in a planned series of what The Connections had internally classified as E-series biological weapons. She could infect other organisms with a psychotropic mold that spread through the nervous system and produced effects that ranged from hallucinations to complete behavioral subjugation. She could make people her family, in the only sense she understood family, people who obeyed her, who stayed with her, who could not leave. She had grown up wanting something that nobody had ever given her, not because they were cruel exactly, but because they were trying to build a weapon, and the weapon's emotional needs were engineering inconveniences. The Connections had raised her in conditions of clinical isolation, managing her biochemistry with medications to maintain the appearance of childhood, using her in controlled field tests. In October 2014, Evelyn was being transported on a tanker ship when something went wrong. The ship was lost in a storm. Evelyn used the chaos to infect the crew, and by the time the tanker washed ashore on the Louisiana coast near Dulvey, the ship had become a floating charnel house. The Baker family found the wreck. Jack Baker, a farmer, brought the injured people he found aboard home to his family's estate to recover. Within days, his family, Jack, his wife Marguerite, his son Lucas, his daughter Zoe, were infected with Evelyn's mold. Mia Winters was among the people found on the tanker. She too was infected. They all became part of Evelyn's family, in the compulsory sense of the word, unable to leave, unable to refuse the role she had assigned them. Mia had been working for the Connections. This was the secret she had kept from Ethan throughout their marriage. Her actual employer, her actual work, the work that had placed her on that tanker as Evelyn's caretaker. She understood what Evelyn was in a way the Baker family could not, and she had sent the email to Ethan from a moment of partial clarity, a window in Evelyn's control through which her actual feelings had been able to communicate. The message was partly asking for help, and partly warning him away, both at once, because loving someone while knowing that leading them toward you will put them in danger produces exactly that kind of fractured communication. The Baker estate, by 2017, had become something that people in the area avoided. The family had developed a reputation for violence that kept visitors away, and local authorities uninterested in investigating too closely. 3 years of mold infection had changed each of them in specific ways. Jack Baker had become enormous and functionally indestructible, his regenerative capabilities so developed that he could recover from injuries in seconds and continue fighting. Marguerite controlled insects, swarms of them, directed with a precision that the human nervous system should not have been capable of. Lucas had been secretly immunized by the Connections in exchange for his observations on Eveline, which meant he retained more of his original personality than the rest of his family, which in his case was a mixed blessing, given that what he retained was an appetite for cruelty. Ethan drove to the farmhouse. He found the guest house at the edge of the property, went inside, found Mia in the basement. She warned him to get out before Daddy found them. And then Jack Baker found them. What happened to Ethan in the guest house happened quickly and catastrophically. He was killed. His head was crushed. The clinical description of what Jack Baker did to Ethan Winters in that guest house, measured against the standards of what kills human beings, leaves no room for ambiguity about the outcome. Ethan Winters died in the Dulvey, Louisiana guest house of the Baker estate on July 19, 2017. But the Baker estate was saturated with Evelyn's mold. 3 years of the organism spreading through every surface, every piece of wood and stone and soil, had created an environment where the mold was effectively omnipresent. When Ethan died, when his body lay on the floor of the guest house, the mold reached him within minutes. It did what it had been doing for thousands of years in the mountains of Eastern Europe, in a cave beneath Mother Miranda's village. It preserved, it copied, it replaced what had been damaged with fungal tissue that could perform the same functions. Ethan woke up being dragged into the main house by Jack Baker. He believed he had been knocked unconscious. He had no memory of dying because the mold's copy had been made in the moment before consciousness ended, and the copy had no gap to account for. This is what the franchise would later reveal. In the Romanian village 2 years after Louisiana, and it reframes every moment of Resident Evil 7 in a way that is difficult to fully process once you understand it. The house was a puzzle and a nightmare simultaneously, a farmhouse that had been extended and modified over decades of occupation, full of locked doors and hidden passages and the specific domestic horror of spaces that had been ordinary before something terrible moved through them. Family portraits. A dinner table set for a meal that nobody would eat. Children's drawings on a refrigerator, faded, from a time when the Baker family had children young enough to make refrigerator art. Ethan fought through the estate. He found Zoe Baker, the daughter, the one family member who had never fully surrendered to Evelyn's influence, because some people's sense of self is more resistant to that kind of pressure than others, and because Zoe Baker was, underneath the circumstances she had been trapped in for 3 years, quite stubborn in the ways that matter. She helped him. She gave him what she could, which was a path through the estate and the formula for a serum that could potentially cure the family's infection. He killed Marguerite in the old greenhouse, where she kept her insects in conditions that had ceased to resemble anything a healthy mind would maintain. He killed Jack Baker twice, once in the flooded basement with a series of improvised solutions to a problem that conventional combat could not solve, and once more in the garden with a serum that was supposed to be a cure and that instead accelerated a mutation that had been building for 3 years. He found Mia on the tanker where the whole thing had started, the wrecked ship, now embedded in the bayou like a ruined landmark. He found Evelyn's lab documentation, the truth of what she was and what the mold could do. He synthesized the specific agent that could kill her using the equipment in the hidden laboratory beneath the salt mine at the property's edge. The salt mine laboratory was the Connection's primary field research installation, maintained by Lucas Baker in exchange for his immunization deal. Lucas had been using the facility not for anything that served the organization's interests, but for his own purposes. An elaborate series of death traps designed with a creativity that reflected genuine intelligence directed entirely toward cruelty. His relationship with the Connections was that of someone who had found the perfect cover for what he wanted to do anyway and who had no particular loyalty to anyone who had not immunized him from his own family's fate. Lucas was not sympathetic, but he was coherent in a way that the other Bakers were not, and that coherence made him more frightening rather than less. Evelyn herself is the franchise's most genuinely tragic figure when you let the full weight of her circumstances register. She was engineered as a weapon. She was raised as an experiment. She was given intelligence and emotional capacity, the capacity to want, to love, to feel the absence of connection, because those things made her more effective as a tool for controlling targets. And then she was denied the very things she had been given the capacity to want, because having those needs met was not relevant to her function. The Connections did not consider what it meant to create a conscious being and then treat that being's conscious desires as engineering inconveniences. They created a child who understood, on some fundamental level, that she was being used, and whose response to that understanding was to try to build the family she had never been allowed to have through the only mechanism she had, the mold that she was made of. She infected the Bakers because she wanted them to be her family, and the only way she knew how to make something hers was to put herself inside it. She was 10 years old, and she had been 10 years old for most of her life, chemically maintained at a point of eternal childhood by an organization that had decided this was most useful for their purposes. Without the medication, she aged catastrophically. Without the connection she had built with the Baker family, she had nothing. The old woman in the wheelchair was not a twist or a horror reveal. She was the final image of what it looks like when someone is used until the using is done and then left to deteriorate in the mess their using created. Ethan injected her with the toxin. She transformed. A last desperate biological mutation, the kind that organisms produce when survival is no longer possible, and the only remaining option is to make the end as dramatic as possible. And then Chris Redfield arrived. He provided the weapon. Ethan delivered the final shot. The estate was over. Mia was on the helicopter. Or the woman Ethan believed was Mia was on the helicopter, because Mother Miranda had been monitoring the Winters family for some time, and had made arrangements of her own that Ethan would not discover until he arrived in a European village and found his daughter missing and had to have the worst conversation of his life with a fragment of a dead bioweapon living in the mold of his own cells. Chapter 10. The Village and the Choice. Resident Evil Village, February 2021, 18 months after Louisiana. Ethan and Mia in a house in Eastern Europe, under BSAA protection, in the kind of quiet that follows catastrophe, when the people involved are trying to build something ordinary in the space that the catastrophe left behind. A child, Rosemary, Rose, born in this house, in this new life, in this quiet. The quiet lasted until February 6th, 2021. Everything that led to that night in the Winters European home has been told in other parts of this story. The ancient organism beneath the Romanian mountains, the woman who touched it in 1919, the century of experiments, the four lords, the biological conditions that made Rosemary Winters, born of two parents whose cells were entirely composed of fungal tissue, the first person in the history of the world to be a perfect vessel for a stored consciousness. All of that history, all of that consequence, converging on a house in Eastern Europe, where a man and a woman and their daughter were trying to have a normal life. Chris Redfield's team arrived first. The intelligence that had reached the BSAA about Mother Miranda's interest in Rose had been developed over months of surveillance, and Chris had made the call that a preemptive extraction was necessary. He understood that the woman in the house was not actually Mia Winters. He did not understand everything that Miranda was, or everything that she wanted, but he understood enough to know that Rose needed to be moved to a secure location before Miranda made her next move. The woman Chris shot was Miranda. She had been living as Mia for days, studying the family, waiting. The real Mia Winters was alive, somewhere in Miranda's possession. The transport vehicle carrying Ethan, Rose, and 2 of Chris's team members was brought down before it cleared the mountain road. Miranda had been watching. The impact was devastating. Ethan woke up in a ruined vehicle on a mountain road in the middle of a European winter. His daughter was gone. The team members were dead. Somewhere beyond the trees, visible in the cold distance, was a village. Lights in windows, the shape of a castle on the hill above it, the faint wrong sounds of things moving in the darkness between the buildings. The village of Mother Miranda, the community she had presided over for a century, shaped around her cult, populated by the descendants of the original families whose ancestors had accepted her as a prophet during the Spanish flu pandemic. A village where the residents knew what lived under the mountains and what that knowledge cost, where the children were told stories about the Black God from birth, where anyone who questioned the order of things had a tendency to disappear. The 4 lords presided over their territories with the specific cruelty of people who have spent decades in the company of someone who views them as useful failures. Alcine Dimitrescu in Hir Castle, 3,000 meters above the village, pursuing her blood requirements with elegant brutality and the particular pride of someone who has decided that being chosen, even to be a monster, is better than not being chosen at all. Salvatore Moreau in the flooded reservoir to the north, mutated beyond anything that resembled his original form, fixated on Miranda's approval with the desperate intensity of someone who knows they are unlikely to receive it. Donna Beneviento in her mansion in the valley, surrounded by the dolls her family had always made, her hallucination-inducing capabilities and her fractured mind having produced an environment that was more like a manifestation of unprocessed trauma than a place of residence. Carl Heisenberg in his factory at the mountain's base, surrounded by the undead soldiers he had built from stolen bodies and stolen machinery, the only one of the 4 who saw Miranda clearly enough to hate what he saw. Ethan moved through all of their territories. He recovered what Miranda had taken. He fought his way through experiences that should have killed him, and that, in the strict biological sense, could not kill him because he had already been dead for 4 years. The thing about being made of mold is that the mold can repair what damage occurs to it, provided enough of the network remains functional. The thing about being functionally unkillable is that it does not feel like safety. It feels like surviving things that keep getting worse. There is something worth noting about how each of the lords dies that the game never fully elaborates. Dimitrescu in her castle falls to cold, the temperature drop that Lady Winter brings into the spaces where her blood-fed warmth had always been sufficient. Beneviento falls to her own game. The strategies she used to protect herself turned against her by someone who had already survived unimaginable things and did not have the luxury of being frightened for long. Moreau falls in the reservoir that had been his domain, his mutations and his desperate loyalty to Miranda insufficient against someone who understood that fighting a mutated reservoir creature on its home terrain required working smarter than harder. Heisenberg falls last and largest. His factory, his army of reanimated dead, his magnetic powers, all of it accumulated over years of planning for the rebellion that Miranda would not allow, all of it not quite enough when the rebellion was finally necessary. And the Duke watched, from his impossible carriage, appearing at places that made no physical sense, knowing things that nobody should know, selling weapons and ingredients and upgrades to a man he had apparently been waiting for. The Duke's role in Village is not resolved by the game's end. He is a thread that the story leaves deliberately loose, as though Capcom is preserving something for later. But his presence throughout Ethan's journey, the quiet, enormous, amused presence of someone who exists outside the ordinary rules and finds the whole thing interesting, in a way that might look cold from outside, but feels, on reflection, more like the perspective of someone who has been around long enough to understand that the outcome matters more than the suffering on the way to it, is one of the game's most distinctive touches. Miranda ripped his heart out in the ceremony square. This was intended to be definitive. What happened instead, the fragment of Evelyn's consciousness within him, offering the truth of what he was, and Ethan choosing to keep going anyway, is the moment the franchise offers as its answer to the questions it has been building toward since the Baker estate. What makes you a person is not what your cells are made of. It is what you choose to do with the consciousness those cells are carrying. Chris shot Miranda in the head. The distraction was enough. Ethan fought and won. Miranda, who had spent a century pursuing the resurrection of her daughter through every tool available to her, including 100 years of human suffering, died in the village she had built around her grief. Ethan held Rose. Rose was alive. The ceremony had not completed. She was Rosemary Winters, not Eva, not the vessel Miranda had shaped a century of history to create. She was a child with her father's eyes and a biological composition that would take her years to understand, but she was herself. The megamycete erupted from underground. The ancient organism, registering the death of the woman who had served as its most significant human interface for a century, expressed itself in the only language it had: biological expansion, tendrils reaching toward anything living, attempting to consume and preserve. The BSAA had prepared for this. A device. One person needed to stay behind with it. Ethan gave Rose to Chris. In the silence that preceded the detonation, he had a moment with the understanding of what he was and what he had chosen to be. Mold shaped like a father, a copy that had loved as completely as the original could have. A man who had died in Louisiana and spent 4 years being someone's husband and someone's father without the biological right to the title, and who had now spent a night fighting through a Romanian village without the biological right to keep walking, and who was going to make sure that his daughter grew up as herself, rather than as someone's lost child, reborn in her body. The detonation consumed the village, the megamycete, the remaining structures, everything that Mother Miranda had built around her grief, everything that the lords had ruled over, everything except the helicopter rising above the smoke, carrying Chris Redfield and a little girl named Rosemary Winters toward whatever came next. Chapter 11, What the Future Carries. The world after the village. Rose Winters grew up knowing something was different about her. The mold composition that made her a perfect vessel for Miranda's plans did not disappear when Miranda died. It remained, developing as Rose developed, producing abilities that emerged gradually through adolescence, and that made ordinary life a complicated navigation of what to conceal and what to express. 16 years after the village, the world has changed again. The BSAA, the organization that Chris Redfield had helped found, that had spent 2 decades as the primary international response to bioterrorism, had been discovered to be using BOW soldiers of its own. Creatures engineered along the lines of Umbrella's old programs, deployed under BSAA colors, a revelation that undermined the moral foundation the organization had been built on. The contamination of institutions by the methodologies they were created to oppose, the same pattern that had recurred throughout the franchise's history, from Umbrella to the Connections to every organization that had looked at bioweapon technology and decided that possessing it for defensive purposes was different from developing it for offensive ones. Chris Redfield had been living with the knowledge of the BSAA's corruption and working quietly to address it through a private organization. He had maintained contact with Rose. He was, in the way that people who have survived extraordinary things together sometimes are, a kind of uncle, present at the edge of her life, available when things became difficult, carrying his own complicated version of the grief and responsibility that the events of 2021 had left him with. Rose's powers, the ability to perceive the megamycete's realm of stored consciousness, to manipulate mold growth, to access fragments of the memories that the ancient organism had been archiving for thousands of years, were extraordinary and isolating. Not isolating because they were frightening, though they were that. Isolating because they placed her in a category of existence that had no map. She was not a bioweapon, not in any sense that the Connections would have recognized. She was not an experiment. She was a person who happened to have been born from 2 parents whose cells were entirely composed of fungal tissue, in a world that had not prepared any framework for understanding what that meant. The Shadows of Rose expansion, the DLC that followed Village, finds her at 17, attempting to use the megamycete's realm to remove the abilities she has come to see as a burden. The logic is the logic of someone who has spent their entire adolescence being exceptional in ways that make ordinary connection impossible, who wants desperately to be unremarkable. She goes into the realm of stored consciousness and encounters the versions of people that the organism has preserved, including, in the most significant encounter, a presence that identifies itself as her father, not a memory, not a simulation. Ethan Winters, stored in the same fungal network that has been archiving human consciousness since before recorded history, existing as consciousness in biological tissue in exactly the same way that Eva had existed, waiting for over a century. Whether what Rose encountered is Ethan or the Megamycete's copy of Ethan, the distinction that the franchise carefully refuses to resolve is the same question that the entire story of Ethan Winters has always asked. If the copy is perfect, if the consciousness is continuous, if the love is identical, does the biological substrate make a meaningful difference? The question extends forward in time, in ways the franchise has not yet fully explored. Rose lives in a world where the Megamycete's knowledge, Miranda's research, Birkin's work, the T-virus program's decades of development, everything that the original biological archive and a century of human experimentation produced is theoretically accessible to someone with her capabilities. The organizations that preceded her, that created the conditions of her existence, are gone or compromised or reduced to their components. But the knowledge persists. The pattern that produced Umbrella from Spencer's ambition and Miranda's teaching, that produced the connections from the post-Umbrella bioweapon market, that produced every disaster in this franchise, from the combination of knowledge and institutional power without ethical constraint, has not been resolved by any of the deaths that filled those decades. Leon Kennedy is still operating, somewhere in the world, in whatever capacity the Division of Security Operations has found for a man who has spent almost 30 years fighting the consequences of things that were put in motion before he was an adult. He was last seen in 2015, working with Claire Redfield on a bioterrorism incident that produced new questions without fully answering old ones. His characteristic combination of competence and sorrow about the necessity of that competence persists, along with the sardonic observations that have always been his way of maintaining some distance from the weight of what he has seen. Chris Redfield turns 51 in 2026 by in-universe chronology. He has spent nearly 3 decades as the most consistent presence in the franchise's fight against bioterrorism, and those decades have left marks that the later games make visible in ways the early ones could not. The muscle mass accumulated through training for opponents who were physically enhanced, the emotional guardedness of someone who has lost too many partners to maintain easy openness, the specific moral complexity of a person who has done hard things in pursuit of good ends and is not entirely sure, on balance, whether all of the hard things were necessary. The most recent game in the franchise proper, Resident Evil 9, entitled Resident Evil Requiem, is set in the present, 30 years after Raccoon City's destruction, and centers on a new character named Grace Ashcroft, working alongside Leon Kennedy. The specifics of its story connect to threads from the franchise's past in ways that the complete timeline makes more legible than approaching it fresh would. The condemned hotel at the center of its investigation is tied to Umbrella's history. Grace's own history connects to the Raccoon City outbreak through her mother, who was a victim of the same events that produced Leon Kennedy as an agent. The franchise continues to build on what came before, continues to insist that history is not done with people, even when people are done with history. The pattern that Miranda established when she touched the Megamycete in 1919, that Spencer refined when she taught him in the 1950s, that Umbrella industrialized when Spencer built his corporation, that proliferated through every organization that acquired pieces of Umbrella's knowledge after the corporation's collapse. That pattern is still active. The knowledge of how to produce mutagenic viruses, how to engineer biological weapons, how to create organisms that can be directed toward specific outcomes, is distributed across too many people and organizations and research databases to be contained by any single event or intervention. What has changed is the nature of the institutions trying to address it, and the capabilities of the people on the front lines of that effort. Rose Winters is 17 years old, in the DLC's timeline. She is the only person in documented history to have been born from 2 fully mold-infected parents. She has access to capabilities that Miranda spent a century trying to create artificially, and she exists in a world that has not yet fully processed what her existence means. A world that has produced too many bioweapons to pretend ignorance about what that knowledge enables, but that has not yet found a stable institutional response to the fact of that knowledge's persistence. She represents something new, not Umbrella's ideal, not Miranda's dream, not any organization's weapon or any researcher's experiment. A person with her father's stubbornness and her mother's history and abilities that belong to neither of them and to both of them simultaneously, trying to figure out how to exist in the space between extraordinary capability and ordinary desire. That tension between what the biology makes possible and what the person chooses to do with it has always been Resident Evil's central question, not the monsters. The people who made the choices that produced the monsters, and the people who then had to decide what to do in a world full of the consequences of those choices. Ethan Winters was mold-shaped like a man who chose to be a father anyway. Rose Winters is mold-shaped like a person who is still figuring out what that means. And somewhere in the Megamycete's stored consciousness, the archive that has been collecting human memory since before any of them were born, both of those truths are preserved alongside the truth of everyone who came before them. Every STARS officer, every Raccoon City resident, every Baker family member, every person on every tanker or island or Antarctic base or Spanish village who was caught in the machinery and consumed by it and left a trace. The archive grows, the story continues. And somewhere, in a laboratory that none of us know about yet, someone is doing something with biological material that they have convinced themselves is justified by what they are trying to achieve. That is the complete Resident Evil timeline, from the discovery of the progenitor virus in the mountains of West Africa, to the village in Romania and the 17-year-old girl with her father's stubbornness and the weight of a century of consequences living in her cells. 23 years of in-universe story. Dozens of characters, hundreds of thousands of lives lost in cities and on islands and in facilities buried under mountains. And at the center of all of it, always, the same fundamental question: what is a person, and what are we willing to do in the name of making people better? The Resident Evil franchise does not answer that question cleanly. It keeps asking it with different characters and different viruses and different settings, because the question does not have a clean answer. The horror is not in the monsters. The horror is in how reasonable the road to the monsters always looks, one small step at a time. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, genuinely, thank you. This is exactly the kind of video I love making. And the fact that you are here at whatever hour it is where you are, having traveled through the entire history of this franchise together, that means everything. Drop a like if this helped you understand the timeline or just gave you company tonight. And subscribe if you want to be here for the next deep dive, because there is always another thread worth pulling, more lore to unpack, more stories buried in the files and the background details and the implications nobody talks about. This franchise has been building something for almost 30 years, and we have barely scratched the surface of what is in there. Resident Evil Requiem is already here, and already adding new chapters to this story. New characters carrying the weight of everything that came before them. New mysteries that connect to old foundations. The whole machine is still turning, still asking the same questions it has always asked, still refusing to answer them cleanly because the questions do not have clean answers. We will dig into all of that in future videos. Until then, rest well. Whatever is waiting for you in the morning will still be there when you wake up. Tonight, you are here for this. That is enough. The lights are off, the blanket is up, and the story of Resident Evil has been told from beginning to almost end. Sleep well, and we will see you in the next one. The franchise will keep building, the questions will keep being asked, and as long as there are stories worth telling about what happens when ambition outpaces ethics and grief outpaces reason, there will be things worth saying about this universe that we have been visiting together for nearly 30 years. Good night,